Hi, everyone. This is Marissa Machado, COO for the Texas Association for Home Care and Hospice. Welcome to the TPE Audits, ADRs, prepayment reviews, post-payment audits, and suspensions, the impact of these administrative enforcement tool webinar today. We are grateful to Lyles Parker attorneys and counselors for bringing us these valuable programs and for their continued support of TAC and its industry. Before we begin with introductions, I want to make sure participants heard that CMS will begin RCD in Illinois on April 17. This is only a couple of weeks away. Fortunately, we were able to secure a GBA to come to Texas in June to provide education on RCD. We will offer 2 sessions in June, one in Garland on the 18th and one in San Antonio on the 19th with a live stream option that you can register for. So please go to our registration page and our events page under education and register today. This webinar qualifies you for 1 hour of continuing education for administrators and nurses. If you did not sign up for this webinar through our website, you may use the PDF form attached to this webinar to order your CEUs. The cost is $10 per person. Now, I'd like to introduce you to our speakers today. Megan McCormick. Megan is an associate at Lyles Parker and received her Juris Doctor degree from the University of Virginia School of Law. She previously worked for a home health care agency before attending law school and has assisted with a number of home health audits and investigation. Megan's experience with auditing home health and hospice claims, identifying deficiencies, assisting in improving their documentation. She also has extensive experience in working on compliance plans and developing policies and procedures for home health and hospice agencies. Miss Mary Soul is an associate attorney at Lyles Parker in Washington, D.C. office. She focuses her practice on regulatory healthcare compliance matters, fraud, abuse, and reimbursement issues. Mary has represented a variety of healthcare providers, including home health agencies, psychiatrists, and dentists. She represents healthcare providers nationwide with an assortment of health law issues, including prepayment, post-payment audits with Medicare, Medicaid, and private pay payers, and general compliance matters. She has also worked on a number of home health agency audits, providing feedback to agencies and defending the claims to auditing payers. Megan and Mary, please take it away. We look forward to hearing your webinar today.
All right, yeah, thank you. So this is just kind of a brief outline of what we'll be presenting on. As you heard from the title, we'll be covering briefly a lot of different types of administrative enforcement actions during our presentation today. So just a little background as to why we are seeing so many of these enforcement actions. As you know, as recent as 2015, like 59% of claims were improperly paid. And I mean, really with home health and with hospice, they're just seeing a large percentage of improper payments, and that has led to the increased use of the different types of auditing tools, especially, as we'll talk about more today, the Targeted Probe and Educate program.
Yeah, and I just wanted to briefly touch on what she was talking about before too, the Illinois Review Choice Demonstration. As she stated, that's beginning in Illinois on June 1st, 2019. And as you're probably aware, this program is also going to be rolled out to Ohio, Texas, North Carolina, and Florida. However, the dates for when that's being rolled out have not been announced at this time, and you will be given a 60-day notice. But as you're aware, this is going to greatly affect how you process and receive payments, because the choices are either 100% pre-claim review, 100% post-payment review, or no review with a 25% payment reduction. So no matter what, going forward, once this rolls out, it's going to greatly change how you receive your payments and how you run your business. So we just want to make sure everyone is aware that that is coming, and it had been on hold for a while, but now that they're rolling it out in Illinois again, it does seem to be moving along. All right, so let's get into our first topic, the Targeted Probe and Educate audit. As you're aware, Palmetto GBA is the max for Texas, and Palmetto goes through and they'll review treatment documentation, and they're supposed to cut down on any improper payments. So they're supposed to identify all instances that they deem to be fraud, either not collecting paperwork, not having things signed or submitted on the right time, or not having orders. So they'll go through and check to find any of those types of errors. When they make their decision about who to audit, they'll look at a lot of different things. You might have a billing irregularity. You might have receive a large number of payments, or have more patients than they think is normal. Any of things that makes you stand out might trigger an audit. And so they'll go through and look at codes that are built in all of those instances to determine who to audit. In 2014, CMS began the Probe and Educate program, and this is a review process that they do an audit, and then they're supposed to educate you on why the claims are being denied. So they'll go through and walk through all of your problematic areas and any deficiencies in your documentation, and it's supposed to be an opportunity for you to learn from these issues to then move forward. Of course, at the same time, any deficiencies you have to repay. So it's not all just to be nice to you, to educate you, but it's also to recover any improperly paid funds. In 2017, CMS and the MACs, they implemented the National Target Probe and Educate program, and this was applicable to both home health and hospices. So far in Texas, the hospices haven't really been receiving TPEs yet, but they are being reported in other regions, and so we believe that this will be coming as well. Now, if you want to find more information about the TPE, which I highly recommend, I would recommend that you look at the Medicare Program Integrity Manual. We have the chapter there, it's chapter 3.2.5, and you will be receiving a copy of these slides to come back to later. And that goes into greater detail about what the program actually is, what they're doing, and what your rights are under it. And so I'd highly recommend, especially if you are selected to participate, that you do take a look at what is in the manual. Yeah, so according to the manual, the purpose of the TPE is to decrease provider burden, reduce appeals, and improve the medical review and education process. As I stated before, it's not just about auditing, it's about ensuring compliance by educating you on what all of the requirements are. As I stated before, the requirements for what the MACs can follow and what they need to do is part of the manual, and I'd recommend that you look at that. They can do the TPE audits in two different forms. It can either be a prepayment or a post-payment audit. So prepayment, of course, being before you've received payment for those services, and post-payment after you have already received payment. And either one can be a targeted probe that they're going to look at either something in particular or anything along those lines, and then they will go through, do the audit, and either choose to pay you or not pay you for the services if it's prepayment, or allow the payments that have already been made, or take back those payments if it's a post-payment.
Just real quick, I'd also recommend, if you've not checked out the Medicare Program Integrity Manual, not just for TPE audits, it contains all of the requirements that the MACs are supposed to follow in terms of documentation requirements and everything that they're really looking for. So I really just recommend looking into that, and especially checking out Chapter 7. So if you receive a targeted probe and educate, you will be, they will request to review between 20 and 40 claims per provider and per service. So it's typically between 20 and 40. Now, if you have a smaller census, they may take on a smaller amount, or if you have a particularly large one, they may request more, but typically it's between 20 and 40. And so you can have up to 3 rounds of this process. Now, in between each round, you're supposed to be receiving education. And of course, the idea is that the expectation is that you're not going to get through all 3 rounds. Hopefully you will be educated and reduce your error rate to the 20% that they're looking for prior to that 3rd round. Because if after 3 rounds you are still found to have a higher than 20% error rate, they will forward you to CMS for further action. So as we kind of talked about earlier, the MACs really have a wide discretion in terms of how they're picking what they're targeting. So this can be anything from if you have a high volume of a particular service, or if you have a dramatic change in the frequency of use of a service. The MACs also may just be basing their decision to be looking at your particular services based off of like an OIG or GAO findings for particular risk areas. In general, the MACs target providers who have a high claim denial rate, are just really if you are an outlier compared to your peers. And it can even be an outlier in a considerably positive direction, like if you have a lot of the, what's the word slipping my mind, when you have 5 or less visits for LUPAs. If you have a lot of LUPAs, you would think that would be beneficial, but they look disfavorably on that as well. So if you're an outlier in any way,
or if you don't have LUPAs, then they look disfavorably on that.
Well, yes.
You need to be falling into the range of what they consider to be normal based on all of your peers.
Exactly. And so, yeah, they'll definitely, if you are an outlier in any shape or form, that's going to make you more likely to be targeted for these.
Another good example is if you receive a lot of knee replacements or patients along those lines, so you have a very high physical therapy content with a low number of skilled nursing visits required, which I know a lot of people are after those patients, but those can reduce or increase your numbers to the point that sometimes you'll get an audit even if you're not doing anything improper and you're just treating those patients correctly. Those could just trigger audits because it stands out next to your peers. So if you are selected to be in a targeted probe and educate, you will receive a letter from your MAC, and that will outline the targeted probe and educate process, what you need to do, what needs to be submitted, and what will happen. So it'll also explain the education that you're going to be offered. And we're going to talk more about the education later, but I can't emphasize enough that when you get to the point to be educated, take the education. Many providers pass up on it, and that will be held against you. Also, they will give you a lot of advice about why in particular claims are being denied and not just what's on the letter.
Yeah, they get really specific with their denial reasons. They'll mention patient by name, and they'll even sometimes point to particular pages in your record. I mean, it is some really helpful information to have because you might be thinking, well, my face-to-face encounter notes are great. Why are you looking at it for this patient? And they will point out, no, here's where you're missing this, and that sentence you thought worked didn't work.
And that's very important because it's not just in general like knowing that they're denying it for your face-to-face. It's knowing specifically what is wrong with your face-to-face to ensure that you don't have those problems repeated, especially in home health with face-to-faces, being able to destroy all of the visits that you had with that patient and all subsequent episodes. They can be very financially devastating to lose these based on a face-to-face. So it's very important that education that you receive, you listen and you respond to it and take it into account. Now, they can be wrong. They could give you wrong information, and you can go back and talk to them about that. It's not just that they're automatically going to be right. The MACs sometimes get their rules wrong as well, but it's important to know what they're saying and why. Mm-hmm. So they'll also let you know in that letter of some of the other outcomes, and that's that if they go through and they find instances of fraud, or if they find that you don't respond to your ADR, that they can refer you to either a RAC or a UPIC, any other type of audit that could then address some of your other claims. It is very important that you do, when you receive these letters, that you do respond and produce the documents that are requested immediately and within the time, because it can just open up a whole rabbit hole of problems.
It's not going away. You got to address it head on, and don't put it off as much as you may want to, and you get busy, but the second you get one of these letters, you really need to tackle it. Either that or hire outside help, such as outside legal counsel.
So up on the screen, you can see some of the information that's required to be in the notification letter. They go through and they warn you that they can revoke your Medicare billing privileges, which of course is, you know, devastating because it takes a very long time to fight these and to get a revocation taken back, and it could destroy your business. So it's very important that you understand what's at risk from these audits and why it is so important to respond. It also, with a revocation, you can make sure that if you do get revoked, that you appropriately appeal those decisions at time, because after a while you can really just throw away any of your appeal rights with that.
So we talked a little bit about the education calls, but you can receive education in a number of ways. Most of the clients that I know take it just kind of through a teleconference call, but you can request a face-to-face visit, or you can even ask if they can do like a webinar with your practice. One thing that I will note, I was recently on a targeted probe and educate call with a client, and really the person working with CMS, they did a fantastic job of explaining everything, but they went so quickly that after the call was done, my client had questions, but they felt too nervous to speak up. Speak up. This is for your benefit, and if you're, you know, if the person you're talking with from CMS, the educator, if they're going too quickly, or if they're saying things that you've never heard of, or they're referencing things and you didn't get a chance to write it down, tell them to stop, ask them to repeat. These calls are done for your benefit, and the best way for you to make sure you get out of this targeted probe and educate to not go on to the second or third round is if you actually understand why these were denied or partially denied in the first place. And so also after you receive the educate call, the MACs are going to record, and they're made aware of whether you take the education call. So definitely take the education call. So with the audit, as we talked before, after they've reviewed your claims, they can, you know, either deny it. I mean, sometimes they do allow it, and
Hopefully they allow it.
Yes. But they can identify claims. So what we see and the difference with targeted probe and educate versus some of the later enforcement tools that we'll be discussing, a lot of times what they're pointing out are things that are very easily resolved, as in missing documentation. You may have submitted a record and it turns out you were missing, you know, the face-to-face encounter note, or you were missing, you know, an evaluation or a particular visit date. And so these are just easy things that you can fix, which is again why you want to take on an education call to make sure that you're not missing out on anything, that your whole record is there, and that you're not getting your claims denied for something that can just be so easily remedied.
Yeah, so like we've been discussing before with the education, the MAC will contact the provider in whatever format that is selected to discuss the education portion of the targeted probe and educate. And in this individualized education, like Mary was saying, it's very important that you do make sure that it's individualized and that they can discuss the specific claims, that you are being able to interact with the educator, and making sure that like everything that you want addressed is being addressed, because sometimes they will go through things very quickly and you might have specific questions or specific information that you're looking for. Make sure you get that, because that information is going to be held against you in the next round. So you need to understand exactly what is being said.
Yes.
And like we've said before, do not decline the education no matter what, because they do look very down upon that, and it will be used against you in later rounds.
And also, if they reference a resource, again, on the call I most recently was on, she was referencing links on the MAC's website that were really, they turned out to be really helpful, nice checklist, kind of flow chart that explained things. But again, she went so quickly that it was, you know, if there hadn't been so many of us on the call, we most likely would have missed a couple of them. So if they reference a resource, make sure that they explain exactly where they can find it, or if possible, they may even email you the link so that you can find those resources.
So the purpose of the education is kind of twofold. The first one being exactly explaining why your claims are denied and what you can do to fix them. So they'll explain what was the shortcomings and what they were looking for, what your documentation didn't say, or what was missing, or anything like that. And then they'll also go through, and there's a topic being just being researched in this Target Program Educate. There's a specific thing of. A common one is face-to-faces, where they're specifically targeting face-to-face, and that is really what they're looking for. So if yours was denied for one reason, they'll also walk you through all the other requirements to make sure that you understand them, so it's not denied for those other reasons either. Because the worst thing that would happen is you get the education, you fix all the problems in round one. Well, there's 3 more things you're doing wrong, and now you get told that in round 2. Well, now you have lost a round to fix your problems before going into round 3. So they want to teach you everything at that first educate level to make sure that you are understanding how to get your claims paid. And I will say that they definitely vary how well the education is provided. So you need to take control of that situation and make sure that you're getting the information you need. And if someone's not answering your questions, if they're not able to answer your questions, reach out and ask to speak with someone else who can then address your concerns. And you will have at least 45 days in between the education session and the next round. Now, the education can be provided in the middle of a round. It's not necessarily at the completion of the round. If they notice a problem, they can do it preemptively. And so from the time of that education until the next round, there's at least 45 days. But it could be a shorter time between once you get the results. So just to be aware of that. But that delay from the education to the results is in order to give you a chance to fix your documentation. So that way they're not just looking at the same thing and it's like, well, of course it's a problem. I just learned about it yesterday and I didn't have time to fix it.
Right.
So there is a delay in order for you to get your documentation up to snuff. You will get a final results letter, and that'll detail all of their decisions and why things are paid or not paid, or why you need to refund money or why you get to keep the money. And they will include the details about your specific errors. They'll then go through and calculate your overall error rate at the conclusion of the round. And then they'll use that error rate to determine whether or not you need to go on to the next round of TPE. So this documentation, though, will let you know what the overpayment is that's alleged or what they're not going to pay for if it is prepayment. As we discussed before, it's a maximum of 3 rounds of TPE. If you continue to have a high error rate, though, you can be referred to CMS for further action. And I would say more likely than can, you will be referred for further action. So it's very important that you do address these, take in the education, and reduce your error rate. And you can get removed from TPE after any round once you demonstrate that 20% or less of an error rate. And typically, you can start to see how you're doing. Like, you know, if you went into round 1 with a 30% error rate, and you go into round 2 and you come out with a 30% error rate, you're going to see that you're not adequately addressing what their concerns are in order to reduce that.
And also, just as a note, you want to make sure you're keeping track of all of the claims, because you may get decisions back for individual claims, not all together with that final letter. They might come in beforehand. So make sure that you're tracking, because you can have claims that are coming in over the course of 2 months. And so you want to make sure that you are keeping track of the individual claims as they come in, so that you're not missing an opportunity to address them.
And then once you're removed from TPE, just as a reminder, they're going to continue to use data analysis to determine if you are still falling within what they've taught you. So if they're going through and then notice, like, you know, you pulled back on billing something for the time being while you're in TPE, and the second you're out or 3 months after you're out, you start billing that again, they're going to select you again. Mm-hmm. So just be aware that just stopping doing something for a short term is not going to remove the problem, and would be looked on pretty harshly when you start doing it again immediately afterwards. It just kind of screams of fraud.
Yeah, so as we mentioned previously, the MAC can refer providers for potential escalation at their discretion after 3 rounds. As in, if you get through 3 rounds and you still have an error rate that is above what they are looking for, it's pretty likely you're going to be referred for further action, such as to be put on prepayment or to receive a post-payment audit on larger amount of claims. So referrals include details such as why the provider was selected for a TPE audit, why, like the review of the results. And this is, again, where that comes in. If you refuse education after any level of the round and you get through all 3 rounds and you still have a higher error rate, that information is going to be passed on for the UPIC who looks at you. And if during this process they believe that you are committing, that you may be committing fraud, you will be referred to your UPIC for investigation. So this is just kind of a handy chart that shows, in a very somewhat simplistic way, the process. And we just included that for if you want to look back on it after this presentation's over. It's just kind of a nice summary of what the process looks like, as is this one with a little more detail as to each round of the TPE that you can have.
And how you get out of it. And something that we hadn't mentioned, though, if you get out of a round of TPE, you get out of the TPE audit and you've been successful, they will discontinue it for at least 12 months. Which you can see down there at the bottom of the chart, that they will discontinue it for at least 12 months unless you have some type of billing irregularity or something else that concerns them that then makes you bring you back in. But as long as things stay the same, if you get out of a TPE, you will have at least 12 months to keep going.
And if you wouldn't mind going back one more slide, as this one makes a footnote to mention, you won't be reviewed again for 12 months on the particular topic that you were picked for. So if you do receive another TPE audit and you're like, why? We've been following that, chances are they're looking at a different aspect of your services. So it's not that they're not following their own rules and particularly picking on you. Chances are they're looking at something else. So additional documentation requests. This is just kind of, I'm sure you've had some experience with this. This slide shows where Medicare has the authority to request documentation from you. This is just kind of the legalese from the Social Security Act. But it's important to remember that at any time, a MAC has the authority to review any claim.
So ADRs are done prior to payment of the claim, and they're typically handled by the MAC. However, you can get them from other contractors, so be aware. Why do you receive an ADR? It could be that there's a prepayment edit on it. There could be a national edit. There could be a review program of a specific code. It could be specific to you because they're concerned about something about you. It could be a referral source they're concerned about, so they're looking at what you have. There's many different reasons why, but it is typically for a reason. It's not just randomized.
They may say random, they don't actually mean random.
It's going to be that they are looking for something or at something. And it may be that they weren't really concerned about you, but they're concerned about your referral source. But it doesn't matter, because what's going to happen is you will have your information looked at, and if your information is not correct, you will be the one paying. So it's very important that you respond to all of these ADRs, again, as you get them.
Yeah, so another reason why you may be selected for an ADR is that the software that the MACs have are constantly looking through, hundreds of thousands of claims, and they're looking to see if there's any discretionary pattern that they can discern. So sometimes it's not even that an individual is actually looking at your services. It's a computer program. It's an algorithm, and they're determining, oh, this seems like an outlier. You need to go in and check on them.
If you're selected for an ADR, they send a letter to the address on file in PICOs. Make sure that your address is up to date and correct.
Yes.
And that you don't have any problems with that, or like your 855s are all correct. Make sure that any information they have for you is correct. You have 30 days to respond to an ADR, which is a very short time in order to gather everything. And you need to make sure that when your first submission is complete, because it's very easy to win these up front. It's much harder to win them after they've been denied. So you need to make sure that everything you needed, you've gathered and turned in the first round. Not that they're very, as long as your documentation is correct, if they're easier to win up front. They're just harder to get overturned. So you just want to make sure that everything is in order before you submit it. So having a checklist, doing a claim summary of them, all of those things are what we recommend in order to address upfront these documentation is complete.
Yes, especially you just want to make sure you have those things. We've been seeing a lot of physician certification and or face-to-face encounter notes not meeting the Medicare requirements. So at this time, while you do not have an ADR, you may want to take time to do an internal audit and make sure that you understand all of the requirements, the documentation requirements, and make sure that your records have all of those in place, because it is much easier to get an encounter note or certification done in the first place rather than go back 6 months, go back a year and try to get that physician to sign a document for you.
And then for the ADRs, just because they ask for like in home health, a 160-day episode, that does not mean that that is the only documentation you should provide. A lot of times, if this is a continuing patient, they might have an evaluation for their PT, OT, ST in a previous episode, and those documentations would also need to be supplied. Also, a lot of times the initial OASIS, any of those initial documents that really justify why that patient is there would need to be supplied, even though they're not applicable to the exact episode that is being requested. That documentation supports the services that you are continuing to render and therefore should be supplied.
And you are actually required to have the initial physician certification in your document, even if it's the third or fourth episode.
And the face-to-face, all of those things that are requirements no matter what, because it doesn't change.
We have definitely seen denials based solely alone because they did not include that initial documentation.
So CMS requires MACs to review their claims within 30 days of receipt. You should get your answer within 30 days. However, they have up to 60 days after the submission of the records to give you an answer. And then if you have your claims denied in the ADR process, you can appeal them. And you should if your documentation is correct. You should not just take it because as you get denials, it increases your overall denial rate. It then also makes you more likely to receive other audits or more ADRs. And you just cannot just accept having claims being denied.
So now we're going to talk about some specifics for both home health, and we'll touch on hospice as well for ADRs, things that we've noticed through our practice that we see once they receive these ADRs, what they're missing. So you want to make sure that your physician orders and the plan of cares are signed and dated. That is very important. And that the plan of care needs to be signed prior to billing the episode. And as we were talking about a moment ago, you need to always provide the initial plan of care, regardless of what episodes are requested. You also need to make sure you include the plan of cares for the episode that's requested. You want to make sure that the OASIS is for the relevant dates. Your face-to-face encounter, you need to make sure it's an actual encounter note with a physician or other provider.
On this note, I've been speaking to a lot of providers recently who've taken the opinion that if they include the face-to-face information in their plan of care, that is all that needs to be done. And there is the requirement now that you include that face-to-face documentation in your plan of care. And so you should be doing that. However, on top of that requirement, you are still required to have a separate encounter note. So it's not just that you're verifying that the face-to-face encounter occurred, you still need the actual note, not a summary signed by the physician, not some other type of document. It needs to be the actual encounter note from the patient coming in, seeing the doctor, what he wrote up for his visit and what he would have billed on. That note is what you need to have in your record. And it's like, yes, you can go back and get it, but that's a lot of times they don't provide it to you. You need to make sure you have that in your record at all times.
And if you are looking right now for your intake referral process, you should make that a big part of your process, is making sure before you take a patient on that you have that encounter note, or that if the encounter is going to happen in the next 30 days, that there is a schedule so that you can
double check that it occurs.
Yeah, make sure that the appointment happens.
On top of that, making sure that the encounter note meets the requirements, because yes, it's the physician who's doing this visit, and yes, it's his patient. However, you are the one who's going to be held responsible at the end of the day, because it is all of your episodes that will be denied if the physician's documentation doesn't meet the requirements. And if you have a physician who's untimely, is not signing your 485s, is not signing your face-to-face encounters, is not giving you the documentation you need, and even if they're a great referral source, they're not
a great referral source, because your claims will be denied, and if this has already been paid by Medicare, you will be required to pay back all of these episodes.
And that could be extrapolated. So it's very important that you make sure that your documentation is complete immediately, even before you receive these ADRs or any other type of audit, going through and going for compliance now.
Yes. So some more things to keep in mind for home health is that when you are providing this, when you're providing the documentation for the ADRs, you want to include a cover letter that kind of summarizes the care. Doing this up front will help the reviewers, when they're looking over your claim, to be able to determine the medical necessity of the claims. To make sure you point out where you have your face-to-face encounter note in the record, where you can point out where the plan of care is, all of that. It is just beneficial, because I will let you know, these reviewers are looking through tons of medical records every day. They don't care to look too deeply, and they're not trying to help you out. So you need to make sure you're helping yourself.
With that, making sure your record is organized in a manner that makes sense, because they will not keep digging. So if all of your visits are out of order, they might just say that they didn't get notes from certain visits or certain evaluations, which is, again, something you can appeal and you can demonstrate, but you don't want to have to appeal. So doing that in the first place, check your UBO4 to make sure that all of the visits that you billed for are included in the record. Those are all things that are important to do from the get-go before you ever receive this ADR, but especially if you receive an ADR, then definitely double check. You want to make sure that if you have a therapy reevaluation that happens in the episode prior to the episode they requested, you still want to include that in the record, because then they're going to ask, where is that evaluation? Just if there is any special documentation request or any special documentation requirement from your local coverage determination or from a national coverage determination, make sure you have that information in your record as well. And then for hospice, similarly, you need to make sure your physician orders and plan of cares are signed and dated. You need to make sure that it's signed prior to the billing. You want to include a cover letter that explains the medical necessity of the services that were provided, and to point out where in the record they can find the documentation that they're really looking for. You definitely need to make sure you include a signed patient notice of election. And that's for whatever episode is pulled, to make sure that that's included. That's actually one of the common ones I see that's forgotten, especially if the patient's been receiving hospice for a period of time. Or a common error that we see is that a patient is on hospice. They get discharged because of something that they want done, maybe a new battery in their pacemaker, and then they come back on hospice. Once they've been discharged, you absolutely need a new notice of election. You can't just go on. It doesn't matter that they've been on services, that they've been receiving services, they clearly wanted services. Make sure that you have the new notice of election, because after a discharge, all of the previous documentation is no longer applicable. So that's like something that we've seen come up several times recently, and it's something that you really need to make sure is covered. Sorry. And going back, there's a couple other, make sure that, the patient's terminal status is covered. Sorry. Okay. Is covered in the documentation. If you have an LCD, and in Texas for hospice, there are many, many LCDs that you should be looking to. If, for instance, if your patient is there and they have Alzheimer's, make sure that they are meeting the LCD requirements, because they are very specific on what needs to be checked off. If you are not familiar with what an LCD is, you need to be, especially with hospice. They have very, very strict documentation requirements and what levels the patient needs to be at in order to be receiving your services. And if your documentation does not include specifically what the LCD requires, you will get denials. Now, if your patient has a couple different illnesses, yes, they don't need to meet the illness requirements for each and every single one. They need to meet the overall requirement to be on hospice. But your documentation, if it's not meeting one of the LCDs, you should be beefing it up to understand why that patient does still need it. So there should be a lot of documentation on that patient's terminal illness and why they are most likely going to expire within the 6 months, or why that would be the assumption.
So when tackling your ADRs, again, like I mentioned for the targeted probe and educate, you want to kind of keep all of these requests on a spreadsheet. We find that a lot of times you're receiving individual letters about particular claims instead of one nice letter that lists, 30 or 40 claims. And so it's really important for replying and responding to these on time that you have some method of tracking so that you can know when you have compiled the record and when you've shipped it out. If you have a small census, you may want to call the MAC if they've asked for like a particularly large number of additional documentation requests to see if you can get it reduced, because it should be somewhat proportionate to the practice that you have. During this time, while you are receiving additional documentation requests, do not stop submitting claims. Like we had mentioned previously during the targeted probe and educate, you don't want to change your patterns just because they are looking into some of your claims. If you change your billing pattern while you're receiving these ADRs, and then as soon as you've responded to them, you go back to billing the way you had before the ADR started coming in, they're going to look at that suspiciously. So just carry on as normal. I mean, again, if you are noticing while you're compiling your documentation for ADRs that you might have been missing documents in the first place, definitely start, complying with that.
Or if you notice that you were making a billing mistake, of course, don't just keep billing incorrectly because you previously were.
Right.
But then the point being that once you've changed that billing, you would not go back.
Yes.
Just correctly bill. So,
yeah, I guess correctly bill is the main point, but if you are concerned that maybe, I don't want them to look at me anymore, so I'm just going to reduce the number that I'm billing, don't do that and then hold off and start billing again. In terms of keeping your record together, you want them to easily be able to go through your record. So we highly recommend, like Megan had mentioned before, that it's organized in a manner that can be easily understood. But not only that, we recommend putting your own page numbers on it. So that way, when you're writing your cover letter for the records, you can kind of reference to, hey, my face-to-face encounters on this page, or hey, the signed patient notice of election can be found here, or for when they got discharged and came back in, you can find it on this page. So that way, they can't claim something was missing, you can explicitly point it out.
So for instance, we use a software that's the base labeling software. So in the bottom of each one of our page numbers, it will say patient's last name, comma, first initial, then a page number, XX1. So that way, like Mary was saying, you specifically have a page. But the other important thing with that then is when they come back and say, you were missing this, you can say, no, I wasn't, and here's the page number, you received it.
Yeah.
It's very important because a lot of times we find that things are denied for missing documentation that was never missing, but you can't prove that it wasn't missing because you can't prove that they had it. But if it's in the middle of all other pages that they have, it's kind of hard for them to continue to say that they didn't actually receive it.
Exactly. And so, when you receive these additional documentation requests, you want to make sure that you're sending them separately. Even if you are getting multiple claims for a particular patient, you do want to keep them separate, because I've seen it before where they've denied it for one episode, but they didn't deny it for the other. So you don't want all that information in one packet, because then it makes it harder to appeal the episode that was denied, and you don't want to accidentally be appealing the one they allowed and that allow them the opportunity to relook it to see whether they needed to deny it in the first place.
That'll mean repeating some of the information, like the initial OASIS and things like that. But even though you're going to be repeating the information, turning them in as separate packets that address the different episodes is still what we believe is the proper way to address these.
Yes, and if Palmetto sent any documentation to you regarding the ADR, including a fax cover sheet, include that in your record because they want to see the whole record as you received it from them.
And they sometimes have a cover letter requirement, things like that. Make sure that whatever your MAC is going to require, you are complying with to submit these because you don't want them denied for some administrative issue.
Yes, definitely. Also, always keep a copy of the things you have submitted. Put them in a nice folder on your computer where it explicitly says, this is what we submitted on such and such date, because you don't want to lose this information. And as we mentioned previously, they may deny you for things that you did turn in, and you want to have evidence that, hey, I sent that to you. You just didn't look at it properly or whatever. And that's hard to do if you don't keep a copy.
Also, then in the future, if you go to appeal these and you need to get an attorney involved or some other representative, they're going to want to know specifically what you turned in.
Yeah.
And it's very helpful if you actually know. Typically what happens is providers send in their information. They just say, well, I sent in the record, and they have no idea exactly what they sent in or in what order they sent it in. They just printed out a copy of the records and sent it. Well, that doesn't really help us for arguing that something was definitely submitted because things do get overlooked. So like we're saying, keep a copy.
Yep.
So ADRs and TPE audits, they are kind of similar in how you approach them. However, the TPE has a lot more risk involved. There's more questions raised, whereas the ADRs, they're typically one record or one patient, and they're looking for something in particular in addressing one specific small concern versus a large concern over 20 to 40 records with the TPE. So there is also prepayment reviews. And you shouldn't confuse an ADR with being put on prepayment review. So the ADRs being that they came in and asked for one specific record, one patient, something along those lines, whereas prepayment review is going to look at typically 100% of your claims prior to receiving payment. An example being, the review choice demonstration, which we talked about at the beginning, where one of the options is 100% prepayment review. And in those instances, you have to turn in all of your records. You have to turn in everything up front. They'll go through, review it, determine if it qualified for coverage and payment, and then you'll receive payment. That is typically for everything. However, sometimes it could also be code specific. We see that more often with individual providers and offices where they're only looking at specific codes. Home health hospice, it's probably going to be 100% of your claims, so are going to then be reviewed before you receive payment. So it is definitely much more of a burden to be on prepayment review than it is to just get an ADR. So if you're selected for prepayment review, you'll also get a notice, or if you're part of the review choice demonstration in one of those states, they will give you a 60-day notice that the whole state is not going to be moved to it as one of the options. I know you could also choose post-payment or the 25% reduction. I would not suggest picking the 25% reduction. And you are typically informed prior to the prepayment review. And there is a couple prepayment. Okay, so you will be told prior to the initiation of your prepayment review, and then you will have time to then go through and submit your claims and get payment. But as, of course, with doing prepayment, it's going to delay what the timeline is of receiving payment for these claims. And so you should be aware that if you're placed on it, what type of business decisions you might need to make to move around in order to be able to address these changes to your payment scale.
Yeah, and one of the benefits of receiving this notice, since CMS mandates that you get it, is, as Megan mentioned, it gives you an opportunity to know, hey, there's going to be some time where we're not going to be getting paid on time since we have to submit all this documentation. So it allows you to make the business decisions that you need in order to stay afloat without that money coming in. But it also allows you to determine whether you need to seek outside assistance.
So to get off of prepayment review, like TPE, there's going to be some level of error that you typically need to get under. They don't normally tell you what that level of error is. We've talked to contractors or private payers, and they'll say anything under, 10% to 40%. So they won't tell you normally, sometimes they will, but typically they won't tell you what you need to achieve in order to get off of it, but it's going to be a reduced error rate to get off. Mm-hmm. And with that, there's a couple of instances you can do. So you can engage with counsel in order to review your documentation and determine whether or not your claims are meeting the requirements. If they're not, they can help you understand what you're doing wrong so you can fix your documentation going forward, and that way you'll reduce your error rate. You can also have them go through and they can determine maybe some of your clinicians are handwriting their notes, or maybe the face-to-face encounters are handwritten and they're illegible. Well, those could be causing your claims to be denied just because no one can understand what they're saying.
Right.
So you might need to go through and have transcriptions of the notes written, which there are proper ways to transcribe notes and submit them in order to support your services. And by going through and doing some type of gap analysis or something along those lines, they can determine what else you need in your record to start getting paid. Also, like we were discussing, private payers are also starting to use prepayment review at a much higher rate than we've seen in the past. These contractors might pick a specific code for prepayment review, or they might choose to do 100% too. They kind of have a bit more leeway in what they're going to do because they're not held to the same standards. Yeah, but it also is bad because in these private payers, it can hold up your money for a lot longer.
Yeah, and we mentioned briefly on the other slide, one benefit of Medicare, I mean, it's hard to say it's a benefit because prepayment review is not great, but one benefit of Medicare doing it is that Medicare is held to certain standards, including the template letter that the contractor will send to you. It's based off a template. They have to include certain language and they have to tell you essentially what's going on. Private payers are not held to the same standards. They can make up their own language. They can tell you as little or as much as they want, and there is no timeline in which they need to get you off of prepayment review. So it's really, there's a lot less standards and you are more at their mercy to see whether they care.
And so, I mean, we've seen cases with prepayment review with private payers that have gone on for over a year to 2 years, and that having to submit all of their claims for review prior to being paid. And so, and then with very long delays before they're receiving payment, which has been very financially devastating for some of these companies who weren't expecting this or prepared for that going in. And so you should just be aware that whether it's Medicare or it's a private payer, anywhere that you're on prepayment review, you need to focus on how to get off. And so either working to decrease your denial rate. If it's a private payer, also speaking to them, because sometimes they're more willing to tell you what you need to do and what your denial rate currently is and what they're looking for, or what code they're specifically concerned with that you're doing. And then you can fix those problems to move forward.
So when it comes to prepayment reviews, the main thing is do not ignore the problem. You need to be, the second you receive a prepayment review, you need to be reviewing your documentation. You need to be looking to the appropriate guidelines, LCDs, to documentation requirements found in your contracts to make sure that you are following what's required and that your documentation that you're submitting also follows it. So you also want to review the claims that you're billing for things such as medical necessity, because you may determine on your own that, hey, actually this episode really wasn't medically necessary. This patient probably should have been discharged. And you want to catch that yourself before they catch it. You want to make sure that there is evidence that everything's been provided. Particularly, you want to look at the notes that are being kept by the different individuals who you have going out to see the patient, or the different staff members that you have making documentation for your patients at your facility. You just really want to make sure that their notes demonstrate all that they do, because not everyone is a great documentarian. They don't think about these things because it's so second nature to them, especially like when skilled nurses are doing the same thing day in, day out. You need to make sure that they're still recording that, because if you can't prove that a service was given, it doesn't count. You also want to check for your coding and billing to make sure that you're not accidentally billing a physical therapist code when in fact it was a physical therapy assistant who was seeing the patient. So now we're going to briefly talk about post-payment audits. This occurs after you have submitted a claim and you've received payment for it. So for post-payment audits, again, they're not randomized. It can be something as the MAC looking at an algorithm and they're looking for a particular code or they're looking for something that's out of the ordinary and they pick you. It can be due to complaints, be it from patients or from patients' families, or it can even be whistleblowers. From overpayment data, if you have a high error rate where in the past they determined that you were overpaid for certain services.
So that's going back to why it's so important to keep your denial rate low, because if you have a previously high denial rate for other audits, it could trigger future audits.
Yes. You can also be referred from any other government entity, such as other ZPICs, UPICs, especially if you are not only based in Texas, but if you have other businesses across the state line, like in Louisiana or Arkansas, and you're seen by other, if other MACs are looking at some of your other facilities, they can refer you. If there are reports by HHS OIG or the Government Accounting Office where they want to, there's risk areas that they've determined after looking past the past year or two, you may still come up because of your claims, how they fall into that risk area. And if they've heard anything from the state licensing board, that also can make you, a target for a post-payment audit. So the primary concern with post-payment audit is if they determine that an overpayment occurred. So if they determine that after looking at your documentation, you know what, we shouldn't have paid for this episode, the concern is that they're going to then extrapolate based off of that. So if they've looked at, say, 15 claims and they determine that all 15 of those episodes shouldn't have been paid, well, they consider that a 100% error rate and they will extrapolate over a period of a year or two, and it can just really be devastating.
Extrapolated damages can be 5, 10, or more millions of dollars based on the services that you provided to Medicare patients or any other of the federal payers. And so it's very important that you address those.
So for example, I had a client recently who had it was like a 55% error rate, and the actual overpayment amount was $4,000. When they extrapolated, over $500,000. I mean, it's crazy, and especially with home health, in hospice,
we can be tens of millions of dollars for a lot of these home health cases. And to see an error rate of, well, I think we go into this, but it's not uncommon that we see error rates of 100% from these home health and hospices. And it's not that their documentation is necessarily terrible. It's also that they sometimes, like when they go through and do these UPICs, they don't know their own rules. We see them apply rules from previous years or from future years. So they might apply the 2019 rules to a claim they're looking at from back in 2016. Well, that wasn't a rule then. And so we see a lot of errors that aren't actually errors. And that's one of the things that we help address and fight in appeals is making sure that the actual rules that are supposed to be applied are applied.
Yeah, so it's why it's really important for you to be aware of the rules, to be aware of what LCDs are applicable, to be looking at the times when these LCDs are in effect, to make sure you understand the different manuals that are out there from Medicare, to just kind of have a basic understanding of what rules apply to you.
Also to keep a copy of the previous rules, because sometimes once they're taken down, they're a little bit more difficult to find,
yes,
especially for private payers who change their handbooks regularly and no longer keep their previous ones. You should absolutely have a saved copy of all of your handbooks because they will come in handy later on when the rules have changed.
Yes, we definitely would recommend at least downloading it once a year, since that seems to be, in my experience, most private payers like to change it up once a year, change major things.
So quickly just going through suspensions, because I know we're running out of time here. If you're suspended, that means that you will not receive any Medicare payments for up to 180 days. The suspensions can also then be extended. However, what happens in the meantime for all those claims that were billed, it gets put into a fund that will be used to pay back any overpayment that is alleged against you. So you won't probably be seeing that money. So what triggers a suspension? There can be a credible allegation of fraud, an overpayment or underpayment under undetermined amount has been identified, or payments have been made or are scheduled to be made that may be incorrect. So if they think that you've made some error and they think that that error is about to be paid out repeatedly, they might suspend you to make sure that that doesn't happen. Also, with the credible allegations of fraud, I think we go into this in the next slide, but there's several instances of what could cause that. It could be a fraud hotline complaint, which that could be from a current employee, a past employee, those could be anyone, or even a competitor. But if they think that that seems a credible allegation of fraud, they could suspend you in order to give themselves time to investigate. Or most importantly, you could fail to respond to a medical records request, which is why we keep going on.
Do not ignore it when you receive it. The second you receive it, you need to take action, be it that you call for outside help or that you make sure you have some dedicated staff that will look into the issue.
And confirm that everything is being submitted on time.
Yes.
Because the last thing you would want is to ignore a medical records request and suddenly you get this nice letter in the mail telling you you are going to be suspended.
Yes.
Like we discussed before, some of these instances of where credible allegation of fraud can come from. But then how do you know if you've been suspended? You must be notified of the fact that you have been or are going to be suspended depending on the circumstances. You must be notified of the intent to suspend unless you fall into these three reasons here on the slide. So you will be notified of a or going forward that you will be suspended unless you failed to furnish requested information. There's a harm to the trust fund.
So the concern is that, if they do notify you, you may take off and therefore they're not going to get the money that they think is owed to them once they finish their investigation of the suspension. Or if they do have evidence that you have committed fraud or at least credible allegations of it, and it's a real concern that if they notify you in advance, again, you may run off.
And take all the money. So they don't necessarily notify you, it gives them a chance to gather as much money as possible to put away to then apply to any overpayment that they determine has occurred. Now, typically though, you will receive notice because most instances they can't justify under those. So then if you do receive notice, you have an opportunity for a rebuttal. That rebuttal is typically about 15 days, and then you can tell them why you should not be suspended. That is your first, it's not an appeal, but it's your first chance to respond to it, to try to stop the suspension. And you should absolutely respond to that. But 15 days is not very much time to get this together, and so you need to make sure you move quickly. Then you'll also have a process to try to get off of suspension.
So what does this mean for your practice? You want to start compliance now. Do not wait for one of these enforcement tools to come to you, because in this day and age, there's just a lot of, it's very highly likely that you're going to receive one of these enforcement tool actions against you. So you want to make sure that you're looking at what are your processes now for documentation. If you receive any of these, if you receive a TPE, if you receive an ADR, prepayment, if you're put on prepayment review, if you receive a post-payment audit, if you're suspended, you want to look for outside assistance. Now, if you have staff who are, disposable in the sense that they can actually dedicate the time to addressing these issues, then that works. But what we find is a lot of our clients do not have staff to spare. So it's beneficial to just have someone else who can help you with this process, because it's much easier to get this resolved earlier than hiring someone to come in when you're at the second level of appeal or third level of appeal. Because a lot of these things, as we mentioned before, it's documentation that just means, oh, you forgot to submit the physical therapy evaluation, and therefore they denied the whole episode. Well, if you'd known that earlier, you could have done that, but now we're at the third level of appeal. And
also to keep in mind, the people who are reviewing your claims are not clinicians. They are not looking at it with the eye of a clinician. What they're looking for is their bean counter. So they will go through and check each little box. Is this here? Yes, no. And then they'll try to make some determinations of medical necessity or things like that. But they are not clinicians, which is why it's so important that you spell everything out for them. That's why those cover letters are important. That's why you go through and explain the clinical profile of the patient, because these people don't understand what they're looking at. Yeah, sure, they look at these day in, day out, but they are not clinicians. And just reading some medical records doesn't give you the knowledge that a clinician has. And that's the approach that any outside source you have, look at these, should take, is also as a bean counter, where they go through and check, is each box met? Because that is what is going to be held to when you actually submit your records and when you appeal them. Just because you think that you provided the best care in the world, or just because this patient was clearly ill and clearly needed the services, is not going to get your claims paid if the documentation is not correct. So that is why you need to make sure that whoever you have reviewing your records understands that it is not about, medical necessity all the time. It is also about what is in the record.
And also, do not ignore any notice that you receive from a payer, ever. Just make sure, if you have a person who's dedicated to getting the mail, make sure they're looking for that, because often it's crazy, but you will get notice for something as important as a post-payment audit in a nice, regular-looking envelope that is very unassuming, and you might miss it for a few days, and every day counts when it comes to making sure you can compile that documentation together and that you can set forth for an appeal.
All right, so we're here to answer some questions, and we can also take some afterwards if people need to call in.
Okay, so we'll take a minute to review the questions that we got, and we'll get back.
All right, so one of the questions we received is, what if one of your claims is denied, you appeal it and it's overturned, and they go ahead and pay you? Will the first denial be used for calculating the percentage of denial? No, it shouldn't affect the denial percentage if it's overturned. However, I have actually heard of that being problematic, especially with the TPEs. I've heard instances of home health agencies that won all of their claims on denial, but they were still passed on to the second round of TPE. It shouldn't be used to calculate your overpayment for your denial rate. However, I'm saying, the instances I have heard of them actually doing it, you would then want to address with them. I'm not sure what the final outcome was because we were not involved in that representation. I just heard that through talking to some people at some conferences that's been going on. So if that happened to you, you would want to address that, because you should not be passed on to another round of TPE if you won your appeals.
So another question that we received was, how does $4,000 turn into $500,000 of extrapolated damages? This is a good question. So it's really what they're looking at is the denial rate, and they're looking at particularly what was denied. So for instance, with this particular client, they determined that 56% of the claims, they had to deny it, and it was based on this one code. They determined that she wasn't using the right documentation. And so what they did was they said, well, if these were all denied this go round, that must mean that her documentation 2 years back were also all wrong. And that is where they got the amount from. So that $4,000 denial was because they denied for those individual codes from this particular sample that they drew, and then they extrapolated it by going back and saying every time that she has billed this code for the past 2 years, she must have done it wrong, and therefore we're going to take our money back.
Another question was, can you appeal the extrapolated portion of a denial even if the claims may have a valid denial? And yes, you can appeal specifically the extrapolation and argue that the extrapolation was performed incorrectly, or something along those lines where you have a reason for why that extrapolation would not be correct based on the services you performed. However, those arguments are harder to make. You need to bring in a qualified statistician typically to look at the documentation. They need to do a FOIA request to get all the information from the MAC to go through and determine how it was performed, and then you can create a appeal of just the extrapolation. We also were asked what LCDs and NCDs are. An LCD is a local coverage determination, and an NCD is a national. Those lay out additional requirements that you have to comply with. So home health has their own, hospice has their own, and they will lay out requirements for additional things that they've determined need to be in your records. And so you would need to go to Palmetto and see what their LCDs are.
Yeah, LCDs are contractor specific versus the national coverage determination, as the name says, it's more applying to the service on a national scale.
Yes, and so both of them, though, would be additional rules for you to comply with. And so specifically, like the example I was giving, for hospice, they will have LCDs on what a patient has to meet in order to qualify as a hospice appropriate patient. So that determines what they consider to have 6 months or less. And so those terminal illness determinations, they lay out, you need to have a 6F for Alzheimer's. And if you don't meet those requirements, you don't meet the LCD.
So we just got a question in that says we usually put 7 PT-OT visits for all of our PT-OT episodes to avoid overbilling. Will this not red flag us? You shouldn't, and maybe I'm reading this wrong, but the way I'm reading this is that even if you had more than 7 visits, you're only putting down 7. You need to accurately bill what occurs.
Yeah, you need to bill for the services that you're rendering. I didn't know if you were saying that as what you estimate, but you should be putting down specifically. Now, if you're talking about what your estimation is up front, you should also be making a determination of what the patient's actually going to require and not just have a standard answer.
Things should be, because all right, what I will tell you is that when the contractors are looking at your documentation, they will notice patterns, because when you are looking at these documents over and over and over again, especially for 20 to 40 claims, and you're starting to see things that look the same, that's what's going to stick out. So if you're always putting down in the plan of care 7 PT or OT visits, that's going to start to look suspicious, because these are individuals that should all have different needs, and that needs to be determined by the physician prior to them starting the episode. So there should never really be one set of number that you're using. Even when you're trying not to overbill, you just have to make it individualized. It needs to be based on what's really required. That's at the end of the day.
Does the nurse practitioner who performs a face-to-face encounter have to have the progress notes also signed by the overseeing physician? Yes, you should. Is it absolutely required? Technically, no, because the nurse practitioner can do the face-to-face encounter, and then the physician can sign the certification, and that's fine. But as they are the overseeing physician, and as that physician is supposed to have reviewed that note prior to certifying the patient for home health, it should be signed also by the certifying physician. And the benefit of that being, it also clarifies the relationship that nurse practitioner is actually under the supervision of the physician, because sometimes they come back and are like, well, who is this nurse practitioner? Mm-hmm. It clarifies that relationship up front. It removes any risk areas with that. And so I would, and what I recommend my clients is absolutely yes, have it signed.
But if you are having a physician that is being particular and not wanting to do this, I would definitely seek out the Medicare guidelines, because there is specific permissions for nurse practitioners or non-physician practitioners to perform the face-to-face, but you need to make sure that they are meeting those requirements. And they're very specific, and I cannot recite them off the top of my head, but I would definitely look into that if you're having difficulty getting the physician to sign their non-practicing, their non-physician.
And so someone asked about the slides. Yes, these are going to be sent out to everyone who attended the webinar, so you will be getting a copy. Also, someone asked about the prepayment review that's rolling out in Illinois this June. Yes, it's starting June 1st. They just announced that they are going forward. Right now, they have not scheduled when it's going to Texas. However, Ohio, Texas, North Carolina, and Florida are the other 4 states that have been selected to participate. And so those states, I would assume, are going to be rolled out at some period of time. We don't know when. You'll get at least 60 days notice, but it, like, you know, Illinois just found out, and they're having to make their decision by April 17th, or by May 16th. So they have starting April 17th to May 16th to decide what type of review they want to be on. So it's a very quick moving process. So you will get warning, but be on the lookout, because now that they're rolling it out, it could be coming to Texas sooner.
And as TAC mentioned at the beginning, they're going to be offering more education on this. So definitely be following the emails so that you can make sure that you're up to date with what will be required, and to learn a little bit more about the process, more than we can tackle here in this webinar.
Someone else noted that the signature of the physician on the face-to-face encounter should be dated. Yes, that's true. They should co-sign it with their signature and date, because the date identifies when they reviewed that note. We've also, though, like, I mean, you shouldn't be denied for a date, because you should be able to go back and do an attestation specifically to address a not dated signature, but to avoid any complications or having to go into those links, yes, you should just make sure that they're signed and dated up front by the overseeing physician. Of course, it needs to be signed and dated by the nurse or nurse practitioner who actually performed the service as well.
And just one last question, because I saw that there was some confusion earlier in the presentation about how does a TPE differ from an ADR. The TPE is a very guided process, and as the flow charts demonstrated, there are a lot of steps, and throughout the way you will be in communication with the MAC. But with an ADR, it is not as it's not as high risk in terms of you're not going to have that direct contact. You'll receive a letter, you'll send in the documentation.
You also won't get the individualized education following an ADR.
Exactly.
So the educate process is a real difference between TPE, which also addresses more claims and more concerns for going into it. And finally, some people are discussing, like, you know, they've been told that the reviewers are nurses. We're not saying that no one who reviews a claim has any type of medical knowledge, but yeah, like, what is their experience? Did they just go out and get a license and then immediately start reviewing claims? Also, it's highly improbable, based on the people I've spoken to and the ones we've worked on, that many, if any, had any type of actual experience working as a nurse or as any type of provider. I think many of you guys would agree, based on the letters you've gotten or the answers you've gotten from some of these things, where they allege, you know, I saw someone who was claimed to not be homebound when they're a paraplegic. I've
talked before to a contractor who tried to inform me that homebound status was not a requirement for Medicare home health services. And when I tried to argue it back with her, she was like, well, I used to be out in the field. Well, she was obviously confusing that some private payers will allow home health services
for infusions or things that aren't homebound.
Exactly.
But she didn't even know what that homebound status was a requirement for home health. So the knowledge of some of these contractors has been less than thrilling for who you want to speak to about these. And so even if they tried to tell me that they are a nurse, I would be questioning what their actual clinical experiences were and how they can make these determinations based on paper.
But I think that's all we have time for now.
Okay, so thank you, Mary. Thank you, Megan. I can see that this presentation was full of information, and probably you have more questions. So you can reach to Mary and Megan through their emails, or on the last slide, or also reach them by phone. You will get the slides within the next 24 hours. So thank you for joining us again, and see you next month.